Story 1. My Uncle Matt never existed. My family and I have been going through a very strange experience over the last couple of months. It's hard to even put into words or explain what is going on. I guess I can just start off from where it all started to feel off. A few months back, my family had a big get-together. My parents both have two siblings. They all got married and had some kids. Well, all of them except Uncle Matt. He never got married or had kids. That means I have 10 cousins. My aunts and uncles all live within 2 hours of us, so we've all grown up together. That being said, we don't normally have all my aunts and uncles in a house at once. This was a rare occasion to have a family meal when they were all free. I will not be naming every single family member in this post because that seems like a lot of information, and honestly, you've already gotten more information about my family than you ever wanted, but I promise this context is important. Okay, enough with my babbling. Let's talk about what happened that weird night. My parents and I went over to my Aunt Margot and Uncle Ken's house for a BBQ in the backyard. The backyard felt loud and chaotic. I tried to stay out of the way and get the night over with. I was honestly just there for the free food. We were all sitting down at a big table outside. I was so focused on making sure none of the napkins went flying in the wind, I wasn't listening to the conversation. My Aunt Margot came over to the table with a plate of really burnt hot dogs. My mom immediately started to laugh at the sight of them. Is burning food genetic or something? How on earth do you guys always do that to food? The Jensens need to leave the cooking to the Millers, my mom said with a sarcastic giggle. Uncle Ken looked at her confused. What are you on about, Liz? Uncle Ken snapped back. I mean, Margot burnt the hot dogs and Matt always burns food when he cooks. Remember, we had to ban him for months from cooking because we had to order takeout like 3 times in a row. Everyone at the table laughed, recalling their memories. Sighs of recollection bounced back and forth from person to person when my dad spoke up in Aunt Margot's defense. Honey, what are you talking about? Matt is your brother. I really shouldn't have to remind you of that. My mom rolled her eyes in response to my dad. I spoke up because I was suddenly confused about which side of the family Uncle Matt was actually on. You would think I would naturally just know that, but all my aunts and uncles act like siblings and call each other their siblings. My grandparents often refer to their son-daughter-in-laws as just their kids, so it isn't something I always think about. Wait, I'm confused. Whose side is Uncle Matt on? What is the joke? I don't get it, I asked, but was only met with a laugh from all the parents at the table. I finally got an answer from my mom, following the silence of the joke that somehow went over my head. Don't be silly, baby. Matt is your dad's brother. As the words left her mouth, half the table looked confused. Liz, what are you talking about? He is on your side. He is a Miller, my Aunt Margot said as she scraped off the burnt edges of her hot dog. Okay, now I'm with Amanda. I don't get the joke, my mom said while looking at me with narrow, inquisitive eyes, and then at the rest of the group. Wait. Everyone slow down, Aunt June said, speaking up for probably the first time in the night. This is dumb. Matt is not Liz and I's brother. He has to be on the Jensen's side of the family. I sat at the table watching my family in silence. Their eyes darted back and forth. They stopped laughing and were all just scratching their heads. After a few minutes, my mom got out her phone. She found an old family photo from when she was a kid. In the photo were her, my grandparents, my Uncle Paul, and my Aunt June. Nothing out of the ordinary. After looking at the picture, Aunt Margot got out her phone and looked for an old childhood photo. Aha! Found one, she stated as she showed off the photo on her phone. Yet again, the photo was normal. It had my grandparents, my dad, Aunt Margot, and Aunt Susan. The next star consisted of both sides of the family going back and forth showing photos. None of them with Uncle Matt in them. I had a few of my cousins there, but they all lost interest once they ate. I, on the other hand, couldn't be pulled away. I was engrossed in learning where the heck Uncle Matt came from. They kept talking back and forth. They figured maybe he wasn't anyone's sibling. Maybe he was related by marriage or a second cousin twice removed that I just called Uncle Matt, because that was the easiest thing to call him. We all have a relative like that, right? I know an easy solution you might be thinking of is to just call him up. That's also what I said, but he was working, and they didn't want to interrupt him. But guess what? I needed answers, so I decided to call him. However, when I looked at my phone, I couldn't find him in my contacts. I looked through it multiple times. I remembered texting him about something a few days back, so he should have been in my text history. Still nothing. After being weirded out by his contact being gone, I mentioned out loud that someone should call him, regardless of him being at work. No one agreed with me, But once I told them his contact was missing from my phone, they all got curious and looked to see if he was missing for them too. We were all in shock to find him missing from all our phones. The family started to dig through their camera rolls and any digital libraries they had to try and find any photo of him. Uncle Andrew thought he had a photo of the back of him, but we soon found that we all remembered him looking differently. Uncle Andrew showed a picture of the back of a bald man who looked pretty tall. Aunt June called him crazy and recalled him having long curly red hair. It wasn't like we hadn't seen him in a year or that he was some kind of distant memory. I saw the guy last week. He came over to my house to help me with some homework, and I can tell you he didn't have red hair or no hair at all. He was, well, shoot. I can't remember what he looked like now that I think about it. It was safe to say we were all creeped out. As the sun went down and it got chilly out, the group moved inside. Normally, this is when everyone would go home, but I saw Aunt Margot start a pot of coffee. It was going to be a long night. The air was tense and full of unease. None of the adults wanted to go home until they had answers. I could tell the adults wanted to talk more, but didn't want to worry the younger cousins. My older cousin Maddie clearly didn't care about anything that was going on. She just wanted to sleep. We convinced her to take my 3 young cousins into the basement so they could all get some sleep. But not me, I was invested. Uncle Matt and I are close. We see each other all the time. How could I not have a shred of evidence that he even existed? As my cousins shuffled downstairs, all the adults huddled around a big whiteboard Aunt Margot slapped on the kitchen island. They started to write down everything they could remember. What he looked like, the last time they saw him, memories of him. None of it was coherent. It seemed he was a completely different person in all our memories, even if it was a memory where multiple people were around. One of the only things that we could all agree on was that the Jensens always thought he was on the Miller side of the family, and the Millers always thought he was on the Jensen side. My mom recalled a story of Matt and my dad going to a lake to fish, but the hook got stuck on Matt's hat and went flying. My dad told us he remembered my mom telling him the same exact story many times. Everyone had memories of stories where he was on the other side of the family. Soon, everyone was on the phone with a new family member trying to tell them the situation and asking what they thought about everything. My aunts and uncles were talking to realities on the phone I didn't know I had. Relatives that probably only met Matt a couple times at best. All I heard was one dead end at a time. No one knew where he came from or where he went. So the big question was, who is Matt? Was he just some random guy who weaseled his way into the family, telling one side of the family one thing and the other side another? Or was it something so much worse? As the sun came up that Saturday morning, we were all still scratching our heads. The deeper we got into who Matt was, the more freaked out everyone got. I was honestly surprised they let me stay with them all night long. The more digging everyone did, the farther away we felt. The more rabbit holes we went down, the less real he seemed. We couldn't find any evidence that he ever existed. Some of us searched all over the internet for Matt Jensen or Matt Miller, and a few of us searched for other last names in the family. Of course, it was kind of hard to know who we were looking for given we didn't know what he really looked like. After hours of discussion, we compiled a list of attributes that never wavered about Uncle Matt. He was a man. He never had a mustache. He was tall. He was bad at math, and he loved Jim Carrey movies. That might seem like a random grouping of facts, but that's because it was. We couldn't even remember where his house was. Some of us completely forgot, and others remembered different houses. It didn't matter. We weren't going to start knocking on doors to find a man we were concerned never existed. We started to believe that as soon as we began to question who he was, he just simply started to fade away into nothingness. Like it was some kind of self-destructive on his own consciousness. It was around a.m. that morning when people started to fall asleep on couches. The night before started with everyone being determined and saying the night wouldn't end until we found Uncle Matt, but here we all were, exhausted and with little to no answers. It felt like accepting defeat by napping on the couch, but we couldn't do much else. At a.m., we all woke up to the sound of my cousins playing in the next room over. We all sat up and rubbed our eyes. You could practically see the gears turning in everyone's heads as they woke up from their stupors. I could tell when they realized their memories actually happened, and it wasn't just a weird fever dream. My Aunt Margot stumbled to the kitchen while yawning and started to dig in the pantry for something substantial the kids could all eat. It was clear they had already raided the cookie stash. As the adults had a quiet conversation, we heard something come from my cousin Cass that made us freeze. Yeah, remember last night when Uncle Matt gave us all those cookies? It was so much fun. My small cousin said with a hop and a skip. Wait, Cass, get over here and say that again. My Uncle Andrew yelled in an attempt to sound intimidating, but came out with a voice crack. Cass walked over to us looking like a confused puppy who just got yelled at. What did I do wrong, Uncle Andrew? I thought if Uncle Matt offered us cookies, I could have them. Cass, you're not in trouble. This is very important. Are you telling me Uncle Matt was with you guys last night? Uncle Andrew tried to say in a gentle tone to not scare Cass. I mean, not the whole night, but he brought us all cookies and put a movie on for us. Then he said he wanted to go hang out with you guys upstairs. Cass told us with a quiet voice. Everyone started to frantically look around the room, looking for any evidence of him being there last night. We quickly asked the rest of the cousins if they saw Matt, and some kids did, and some didn't. I noticed something when I started to count the objects in the room. There were 10 adults and me upstairs last night. So, there should have been 11 people in total, but I saw 12 plates out with the leftover crumbs from our late-night pizza, 12 spots laid out for sleeping in the living room, and 12 mugs or cups of coffee. He was here last night. As I mentioned what I found, my dad said he remembered seeing him last night. He said Matt brought him some water. Uncle Paul said he saw him go to the bathroom, but couldn't remember him coming out. They mentioned how it felt like it never actually happened, but he managed to place the memory in them after the fact. How else would they see Uncle Matt right in front of them and not realize what was happening? I had a strange feeling that started to bubble up. I felt uneasy and restless. Wait, something is off here, I said loudly to the room. Everyone line up on the wall. I want to try something. For a second, they all looked at me confused. They normally wouldn't let me boss them around like that, but they were desperate and tired. All the adults lined up against the wall. As I walked by then, I counted out loud. Something strange happened. I counted 12 people, including me. None of the kids were lined up. I wasn't counting myself twice. There was an extra person. Uncle Matt wasn't just here last night. He was with us in the room at that moment. Other members of the family even tried to count. We did it over and over again, even adding one of the kids to the mix, but every single time there was one extra person, but we still couldn't see him. How was he hiding in plain sight? Everyone ended up leaving my Aunt Margot's house that afternoon. We were all still extremely creeped out about the whole thing, but what could we do about it? Not much. It's not like Uncle Matt ever did anything violent. Mostly normal behavior, except for a few memories of him that were kinda weird. One of us remembered seeing him in the kitchen, stacking and unstacking bowls for hours. Another person remembered him once packing for a vacation, but his suitcase only had trash bags in it. And I have a memory of us sitting in front of a fireplace with him, reading the instruction manual to a blender for a bedtime story. At least those were the kind of memories we had in the beginning. As the weeks went on, we started to remember things that got more and more concerning. He showed up in our houses in the middle of the night, or buying us all hammers for Christmas. He once bought hundreds of dollars worth of knives and put them in my dad's car. Once we developed disturbing memories of him, we tried to tell the police. Of course, they couldn't find any evidence of his existence, so they couldn't help us. It didn't help our case that we couldn't even give them a last name. How on earth are they supposed to find a guy based on his name being Matt and no physical features? So who is Uncle Matt? I can say with 100% certainty, I have no clue. Is he a man? Is he an entity? Is he a figment of our imaginations? Or is he nothing at all? I don't know. And that's the worst part of all. He seems to always be around at family dinners. Most of the time I count the number of people, I end up with an extra person. He feels like a virus, always implanting a memory of himself being around, but in the moment, I never see him. It seems to be a family joke at this point, always leaving out an extra plate for him or something. In my opinion, no one is taking this situation seriously. I know he hasn't hurt anyone, but why should we wait for something to happen? I swear I can feel it when he shows up. The hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My family has given up on trying to figure out who or what Uncle Matt is. But I haven't. It feels like they have all just forgotten the disturbing memories of him. I swear, the deeper I dig to find him, the worse the memories get. Like he is rotting and festering in my memories, right before my eyes. I'm starting to think it's his attempt to stop me from looking for him. The fact that he is punishing me for looking for him makes my concern grow more and more. Why is he suddenly running now that I am on to him? Why is he so afraid of me finding him? And what will happen once I do find him? I will find you, Uncle Matt. I will find out what you are. Story 2. I'm the sole survivor of a roller coaster that couldn't be stopped for 12 hours. Last year, I learned a lesson I will never forget. Trust your gut. I had the day off from work. I wanted to do something fun, but everyone I knew was busy. Makes sense. I mean, it was a Tuesday. I decided I'd just go to the amusement park by myself. I've done it before and had a great time. I'm a bit of a thrill seeker. Well, not too much anymore. Going 5 miles over the speed limit is about all the excitement I want out of life anymore. I got to the park at around PM. It was slow, even for a Tuesday. It gave me a sense of excitement because I knew I'd be able to ride a lot of rides without having to be there all day. At the same time, it gave me a weird, uncanny feeling. All this space and not enough people to fill it up. I ignored the feeling and moved on. I don't know about you, but whenever I go to an amusement park, I like to work my way up to the really crazy rides. I'll start small and finish off the day with my favorite. My favorite just happened to be called the Grim Reaper. It feels a little too on the nose, doesn't it? It was 7:30 p.m., and the park closed at p.m., and I knew it was time to get in line for my final ride. I also made a new friend while there. We met standing in line at one of my first rides of the day. We decided after chatting the whole time in line that we'd hang out for the rest of the day. His name was Charlie. We agreed on every ride that day, except for the last. He wanted to end the night on the Mindbinder, but after some convincing aka, the Mindbinder's line was way shorter. While passing by, we decided to do the Grim Reaper last. We got in line for the Grim Reaper, and there was hardly anyone in line. It made sense, given that it was almost closing time. Do you think they will let us ride multiple times if the line stays down? Charlie said with his hands clasped excitedly in front of him. I just smiled at him and chuckled. Normally, I would have been excited too, but something in my gut felt so off. For some reason, I didn't want to go on one of my favorite rides. Maybe it was the 5 corn dogs I ate a couple hours earlier, I figured. I'm a very rational person. I wasn't the kind of person to let anxiety or worry rule over me. I always thought life was just what you made of it. When we got in line, there were about 60 people, give or take. The people in front of us did their ride, and 30 of us were left in line. People started looking at the time and saying they were tired and just getting out of line. By the time it was our turn, only 19 people were in line. I knew the ride well enough to remember that it held 20 people, so if no one else got in line, they really might let us go multiple times. I really didn't want that though. Honestly, I felt even more compelled to get out of line after all those others did too. And I didn't want to seem lame to my new friend if I wanted to get off the coaster after one ride. The time came for us to get on the ride. My heart was pounding faster than it ever had. I wondered if I was all worked up because I watched Final Destination 3 with a friend a couple weeks back. But I wasn't having visions of the terrible fate we would all face. I was just feeling off. I did everything in my power to get it to all make sense and to not worry, but nothing worked. I seriously considered just telling Charlie I didn't feel great after the last ride, but I finally found someone with my taste in roller coasters. I didn't want to let him down. We were towards the back of the line, so we didn't have much say in where we sat. We ended up in the third car from the front. I was just happy we weren't in the front car. As you get on the Grim Reaper, it plays a cheesy little jingle. Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The Grim Reaper will find you dead or alive, with music in the background that always sounded so dumb in the past. I couldn't believe it was getting to me. Charlie even hummed along to it while grabbing my arm with happiness. We got in our seats, and an employee came by and pulled down the metal bar restraint to secure us in our seats. It was the kind that strapped you individually over your shoulder. I'm on the chubbier side, but I can always fit into coaster seats. I've never been told I couldn't go on a ride. I'm just sometimes a little snug. It's actually kind of nice because I feel very secure. As we got strapped in, I felt the plastic-coated metal hit my shoulders and chest. It should have given me a sense of comfort and safety, but I just felt trapped. The employee walked back to the station that has the infamous big button that starts the ride. He flashed all a thumbs up and yelled, "Ready for the Reaper?" Everyone raised their hands and let out an excited scream. Except for me. I let out a large sigh, counting down the seconds, trying to imagine Charlie and I once we were off the ride and how happy we would be. The employee hit the button and we were off. The coaster shot out of the loading station like we were a bullet being shot out of a gun. After that, it started on a relatively slow ascent up a point to a drop off of 60 degrees, a couple of twists and turns, a big loop, and some more twists and turns. About halfway through the ride, I was enjoying myself. I was thinking about how the hard part was done, and I was safe. Just a little anxiety was all. We were rounding out our last bend when a sense of relief came over me. I could see the end of the ride. I was almost done. But the ride didn't start to slow down. Normally, the coaster starts to slowly come to a full stop several hundred feet from the end, but it was still going. As we passed by the loading area, I saw the operators look confused as we raced by. I noticed no one else was waiting in line. Someone screamed, "One more time," and everyone on board gave an excited response. Everyone except for me. Charlie looked over at me and grabbed my wrist. Yes, I knew they would let us keep going. This is awesome. He let out an excited yelp as we reached the climb to the drop. He was beaming with joy the whole rest of the lap. We passed by the loading area once again, but this time, the coaster operator had a couple other people standing with him. The operator who strapped us looked red and worried. As we were whipped by the employees for our third ride of the day, the other riders were divided. Some were still excited, screaming, "Let's go. One more time." Or "Best day ever." Yeah. Some people started to sound scared. Not everyone noticed the employees looking frazzled. I can promise you one thing. I noticed. We started going up the incline again. This was the slowest part of the ride, at around 10 miles per hour, and slowing down a little as it reached its peak. This gave us opportunities to take a breath or try to talk, although it was only for a total of about 20 seconds. Are we stuck?" I said nervously to Charlie. "I'm sure we are fine. There is just a malfunction with the electrical system not activating the brakes or something. There is always a manual shut off." He was cut off, and we went down the steep hill. We passed by yet again, this time with more people looking worried and someone standing close to where the coaster would go by. He tried to yell at us as we went by, but we couldn't really understand him. Maybe something about them working on getting us off. This time, as we zoomed by, everyone was scared and starting to panic. I guess it didn't sink in for some people what was happening until right now. We went around a fifth time, and everything remained the same. On the sixth time, we were at the peak and saw a fire truck coming into the parking lot. From the top of the incline, we had a perfect view of the parking lot, along with the side of a highway a little further out. It took 2 more loops around the track by the time the fire department got to us. Not just them, but police officers and ambulances. It started to scare me. Why did they get ambulances? Is it just protocol, or is there more to this? Someone came in a few minutes later with a big white board that they used to write messages to us. The ride was too loud when passing by them to hear anything, so this was their only way to talk to us. It must have been the 12th or 13th time around when the whiteboard read, "Trying to free you at peak." I knew they couldn't write a novel for us because you can only read so much while going by so fast. But come on, people, what is it supposed to mean? I think they just wanted to tell us they were working on a way to get us down, but that didn't matter. We had been on this ride for nearly 30 minutes, and we felt sick, and our bodies hurt like crazy. A couple loops after that, we saw a fire truck trying to get underneath where the top of the ascent was. Luckily, there was a large space where the truck could pull right beside it. Unfortunately, at its peak, it's about 200 feet in the air. It also didn't have any emergency exits at the top, like most coasters do. You'd think that would be a requirement, but what do I know? We saw the fire truck start to expand the ladder that comes out the top, but it wasn't even close. We waited for the firefighters to try and figure out a solution to save us, as the audience below us was watching us like we were some kind of show. It was close to 45 minutes when the first death occurred, then one more soon after. There was a skinnier guy in a car behind me. I heard him talking about trying to slip out of the seat restraint, which secured him to his seat. The other guy he was with told him it was a bad idea. So did I. The next time we went up the ascent, he began violently wiggling and thrashing back and forth, to the point where people thought he was going to throw off the ride. He managed to wiggle about halfway out, right at the top. But well, it didn't end very well. His leg got caught on a part of the track and yanked the rest of his body out of the bar restraint. It sent his body crashing down towards the earth. However, I think he was dead soon after he was ripped out of his seat. I didn't see too much of it, but the guy who was beside him let out an insane screech. Hearing the kind of agony as you are feeling the harsh effects of gravity hitting on your chest while going down a steep hill was truly mortifying. The screech out of nowhere stopped, and more people screamed. The man beside him had a heart attack. I could hear the symphony of moans and crying coming from the crowd watching us. I couldn't hear them before because of how loud the ride was, but they were terrified of what they saw. Police tried to escort them out of the park, but it didn't stop people from parking on the side of the road to watch and record on their phones. It made me feel disgusted. At around an hour on the ride, everyone stopped screaming or trying to talk to each other. It seemed like everyone accepted their fate. My nails were deeply embedded into Charlie's wrist. I couldn't scream anymore due to my throat feeling raw from the yelling. Even if I wanted to, I probably couldn't due to my voice giving out. I saw that I drew a little blood on Charlie, but he was too out of it to notice. He, along with a few other people, were incredibly sick. He threw up probably 5 times by this point and looked cross-eyed. Around that time, the electricity in the whole park shut down. All the lights, everything. I think they were hoping a hard reboot of the whole park would stop the ride. The coaster didn't just rely on gravity, but also on a lot of help from motors and other electronic elements. It all turned off when we were on the straightaway. Of course, it still didn't stop. I could hear someone yelling with frustration, not understanding how it could still be moving if it didn't have an electrical source. After 2 hours, they let some family members come into the loading area, which was a terrible idea. We were doing our best to keep cool and stay calm. Our families watching us, zooming by them every 2 minutes, and absolutely screaming at us, made it so much worse. My mom was my first family member to show up. Don't get me wrong. I love my mom, but she is very stubborn and wanted something done even though they had already tried everything. Of course, it was just because she wanted me safe, but it was stressing me out. The firefighters put down a safety net underneath the ascent. It was still quite a jump if we could even get out successfully to land on it. And we might be okay, but we were all a little scarred from what happened before. It seemed like they put it out just in case someone tried to get out again. It didn't seem like it was the plan to have us all just jump out of that moving death machine. They weren't desperate enough at that point. We saw a large group of people passionately arguing and yelling at each other. From what I could tell, it was made up of family members, firefighters, and some employees of the park. I'm sure with lots of varying opinions. The ride was on R3. When the coaster entered the loading area once again, I saw a woman run over to the control panel. A couple people ran over to her and told her to stop and not press the button. She was screaming her head off and wailing. It had been hard to understand people in the past while going by them, but this was as clear as day. As we passed by, I could tell she was starting to break free from the grip of people holding her back. I wasn't too worried. Whatever button she was wanting to press, I'm sure it wouldn't work, since none of the other ones worked so far. We were about 5 seconds away from going down the descent when we heard a click come from all our seats. The woman hit the button that unlocked all our overhead seat belts. Of course, the seatbelt button worked, but not the button to stop the ride. A few people reacted fast enough to either jump out or snap it back over themselves before the ride went down. Others weren't so lucky. 3 people managed to jump out, but didn't survive the fall. Despite there now being a giant net to catch anyone who was dumb enough to try and get out that high, one person hit a support beam on the way down, and the other two landed wrong when they hit the net. Their bodies folded in an unnatural manner as they hit. All 3 died instantly. I would say around half of us that were left managed to get the seatbelt secured before going down the hill. Everyone else had to hold on for dear life. And unfortunately, I was one of them. I felt my stomach start to drop as I reached up to grab the only thing that would keep me from becoming a part of the pavement below. The restraint wasn't completely useless at this point. I just had a good 12 inches in between my chest and the restraint. As I dug my fingers into the plastic, I hoped I would be fine. Then the ride dropped. I felt my butt lift off the seat I had become so familiar with. I tried to wrap my ankles around the floor of the coaster to keep the rest of my body from flying out. Charlie luckily got the restraint down, so he was trying to get his leg over mine and hold me down with his arm. After the longest 5 seconds of my life, I managed to pull it back down over my chest. I wasn't sure who else got theirs down, but I assumed, from how scared a few of them sounded, it wasn't good. All I could think about and look at was the big loop coming up. As we got closer, I could hear swearing from multiple passengers, including someone in front of me. She was violently pulling at the restraint, but it just wasn't budging. I was hoping and praying that the centrifugal force would keep her in her seat. As we went around the big loop, I closed my eyes. I knew I didn't want to see what was about to happen. I heard multiple people screaming and making horrendous cracking sounds. I don't have an exact number, but I would say only 7 people were left. I could see the 2 people in the very front row and Charlie beside me. I recall only hearing 3 other voices behind me at this point. At hour 5, 3 more people died while on the ride. 2 of them from a heart attack or something. The third person, well, he watched the person beside him suddenly die while going around one of the bends. He yelled out in anger, and well, I'd actually rather not go into detail. But he died soon after. I saw the whole thing. They were the 2 people left in front of me and Charlie. At hour 6, we saw a group of people bringing in what looked like another large net, except that it was in the loading area. The next time we looped around, They wrote something new on the big white board. We are going to try and stop it manually. I had no clue what this meant, but by the look of the net, I was terrified. The next pass, there were people on both sides of the loading area. On one side, the net was wrapped around a large pole that had been somehow fastened into the concrete slab. I saw a large similar pole on the other side, but the net wasn't yet attached. As we zoomed by, I could hear people trying to rush and hurry behind us. We went around one of the turns, and I cranked my neck, looking to see what plan they had in mind. They were frantically trying to tie the other side of the net to the support beam that was freshly drilled into the ground. I couldn't believe how stupid these people were. How on earth did they think this was a good idea? Was this a last-ditch attempt? I was yelling at them and telling them to stop, but of course they couldn't hear me. Even if they could, they wouldn't listen. They were desperate to get at least someone out of this alive. Or maybe the owner of the park wanted all of us to die so that no one could publicly talk about the horrific things we went through. As we went past the last bend, the hundreds of people watching the spectacle cheered, clapped, and celebrated. Somehow, not seeing any of the flaws with this terrible plan. We were on the straight away, and my heart started to pound again. The few seconds before we hit the net felt like slow motion. I swore I could see everyone's face. They looked happy. I couldn't believe it. It made me upset because I knew they were all about to be very disappointed. Finally, we hit the net. Of course, it was no match for a giant metal contraption hitting it. The metal pole was ripped out of the concrete slab and smashed down right in between our car and the one behind us. As we headed for the incline, we tried to get the net that attached itself to us off of the coaster. Luckily, we were able to get it off of us, but no luck with the metal beam that was now awkwardly lodged in the coaster. As we started going down, the whole ride started to shake violently. It felt like we were going to fly off the track. We made it to the first turn. I heard a loud snap and 2 screams. The 7 coaster cars behind ours broke off, and the metal beam found its way underneath. As we turned, I watched in disbelief as the cars behind us all went flying off the tracks. At that point in the ride, it was about 50 feet off the ground. Still enough to kill them. I wasn't fast enough to close my eyes and saw the whole thing. It went off the track like it had wings and suddenly plummeted down into the earth. The screaming immediately stopped when the ride landed upside down. My imagination filled in the blanks and shuddered at the thought of the carnage below me. And then there were 2. We were hoping that somehow the ride would stop or slow down because we lost the back 7 cars. I was not sure what the logic was, but we were desperate at this point. After another hour, it was not showing any signs of slowing down. Once we made it to hour 8, we expected our fate. I was hoping that this would all be over soon and we could just be done. I don't think either one of us thought we'd get off. We just hoped, at this point, that our deaths would be quick. Over the next couple hours, we noticed a piece of metal on the car ahead of us start to wobble and loosen. I'm not sure if it was just the wear and tear of the ride going for so long or the whole net fiasco. It kept looking like it was about to come loose, and we duck out of the way. We were imagining the worst possible outcome, thinking it would fly off and decapitate one of us. Eventually, it did come off. But it wasn't a dramatic moment like we thought it would be. It was so much worse. Instead of coming all the way off, it only partially came off and started grinding loudly against the track. We heard an audible cringing sound from everyone watching below. The sound was horrendous. The thin strip of metal started to find its way underneath the car. Charlie was worried it would dislodge the coaster from its tracks like we saw just hours before. He told me he was going to try and grab it. I begged him not to. After a few laps of me telling him to just leave it, he made up his mind and contorted his body to try and grab the sharp metal. I couldn't see his hand as he reached down for it, but I could see his face. Somehow, that made it worse. His expression quickly changed from focused to shocked in a matter of seconds. His face was blank. I heard screaming but had no clue what was going on. He lifted up his arm and... I don't think I will ever be able to get the image of what used to be his arm out of my head. When he gripped the metal, it slipped and went deep into his forearm. I tried to grab his shoulder to calm him down, but to my shock, he was calm. He was more silent at that moment than he had been the whole day. He wouldn't even look at me. He was almost mesmerized by the sight of his bloodied, disfigured arm. I felt lightheaded and had a ringing in my ears. Watching the blood start to make its way down his entire body, then to me and the floor of the coaster. It was making me feel sick watching the blood move around the car as we went around the twists and turns of the ride. Within minutes, Charlie looked like a ghost. I did my best to try and wrap his arm up with shreds of my shirt, but it was completely pointless. I don't think an old t-shirt can help when you see the bone. I tried to talk to him. I tried to make him feel as comfortable as I could, but it was no use. He was fading in and out of consciousness. We began going up the ascent, and he finally looked over at me. I couldn't begin to explain all that I saw in his eyes. I could see the pain and sadness, but also the relief. He knew he was going to die, but I don't think he cared. He gave me a weak nod of the head and looked ahead when we went down the hill. I tried to keep a close eye on him this lap, but it was honestly hard to look at him. I heard him take a deep breath right before the loop. When we finished the loop, I looked over at him, and well, he was gone. I was now left alone in the death trap. I never imagined it could have gotten any worse. But having a dead body sitting next to you on a roller coaster is not something I would recommend. I was sitting in shock next to my dead friend for a couple hours. I was frozen in fear, not wanting to even think of a way out. After gaining some courage, I contemplated my next move. I came back into reality and realized the coaster was going just slightly slower. It wasn't significant, but if the loops were taking just slightly longer than before, that damn piece of metal that killed Charlie must have made its way underneath, and not derailed it, but slowed it down. I ended up taking off my shoes and Charlie's shoes. I had a plan that was probably dumb, but if I died, at least it would be in my hands. As I went by the loading area, the coaster started to slow down just before the ascent. I threw all for shoes right in front of the ride. A part of a shoe caught the truck in just the right spot. The ride was still. I could feel the coaster almost pulsing, trying to move with all its might. I was sore. My shoulders were badly buried by the shoulder restraints, repeatedly hitting me over and over again. My whole lower half aching from sitting in a hard seat for hours on hours. I took a deep breath and squeezed in my gut like I never had before. I let out a horrific yell as I forced my body out of the restraint that had been holding me down for the last 12 hours. About 360 times around the track. My heart was racing as I felt the coaster start to win the battle to move again. I managed to squeeze out just seconds before it took off. I was freed and jumped. Luckily, I just barely hit the net below. I also managed to hit the net, so I didn't hurt myself too badly. Nothing is worse than what that ride already did to me. I laid on the net, looking up into the sky. In disbelief. I was still. I wasn't moving. It was almost making me feel motion sick, not moving around. Like when you are reading a book in the car and you look up after an hour. Everything was blurry. I could barely hear the faint sound of people trying to get to me. But it was mostly just my ears ringing and my heart beating. After just a few minutes, I was down. They immediately rushed me to the ER, where I stayed for 3 weeks. I sustained a broken rib, a broken collarbone, severe bruising, and a concussion, just to name a few. Not to mention the mental trauma. I'm writing this as I'm feeling ready to finally tell my story. This is the first time I'm digging back into my memories and recollecting the whole experience. I've started to work through all this with a therapist, and it's made me realize I need to get it all out of my system. Don't bother trying to find anything about this story. The owners of the park have done a suspiciously good job hiding it. That's another reason I want to get my story out there. They have completely scrubbed the internet of it somehow. Although talking with a professional has helped, there are still some sounds and images that I can just never completely get out of my head. If you take one thing from my story, it's that you should trust yourself. Even if you don't believe in a higher power or gut instincts. If you have a feeling, trust it. Please. Story 3. Something twisted my brother's head clean off. I found out what it was. I wasn't the one that found Maddie. It was his wife, Elizabeth, back from a night shift at the hospital, eager to shed her scrubs and settle in for a long sleep. Instead, she walked into the bedroom to find Maddie sitting in a chair, his severed head in his lap. I would have preferred not to hear any further details about my brother's body, but when Elizabeth called me on the phone, hysterical, she couldn't help but overshare. Dark bruises covering his arms and legs. There was blood everywhere, soaking through his white t-shirt and striped pajama pants, pooling all around the wicker chair where he sat. The skin of his neck was frayed where it had been ripped apart, almost like a popped balloon. The muscle, too, was stretched and torn, and the vertebrae stuck from the top of his neck hole like a white sleeping worm. Though we hadn't spoken much in the last few years, I was the only family Maddie had left. I caught the next flight to Boston and met up with Elizabeth at her parents' house. She started screaming as soon as she saw me. Or maybe she'd been screaming all day. Maybe I looked too much like my brother for her to handle. After a few hours, she calmed down enough to start saying a few words. I asked her if Maddie had been in any kind of trouble. He'd been reckless in his late teens and early 20s, selling drugs on campus. It was small-time stuff, but he'd made a few bad enemies, Guys that put a real scare into him one night that made him get out of the game altogether. There was nothing like that, she said. He's totally clean. Got a good job clearing out old houses. Like when someone dies, he gets all the junk out, gets it sorted. Helps sort out the junk from the antiques. Takes a commission of the sales. Does he skim? I asked. Maybe someone felt cheated? She shook her head. He buys the stuff he likes. But it's always a fair price. Everybody loved him. Everybody. The cops investigated, of course. But there were no leads. No evidence of a break-in. No one with a grudge. It was like Matty had twisted his own head off and set it in his lap. One of the detectives mentioned that more than half of murders go unsolved. It seemed this would be one of them. Weeks passed, and I stuck around, trying to help Elizabeth put her life back together. Even after the police were done scouring her place, she refused to go back in. We hired some people to clean up the blood, but they told me there was only so much they could do. The hardwood in the bedroom would never give up that stain. Finally, it fell on me to go into the place and gather a few of Elizabeth's things. They were going to put it up for sale. She was still in pieces, planning to move back in with her parents, probably permanently. I rented a truck and some basic tools, told her I'd get to work. Up until that point, I'd been staying in a cheap Airbnb nearby, but with Maddie's house reopened, I figured I could spend a few nights there while I packed up. When I mentioned the idea, Elizabeth gave me a weird look. You shouldn't stay there, she said. Why not? I asked, but she couldn't come up with a good reason. Of course, the day I got into the place, the first thing I did was head to the bedroom. I guess I just had to see it. The cleaners had clearly scrubbed the hell out of the place, but there was still a nasty stain in the center of the room. The mark was roughly circular, and maybe 3 feet across, mostly gray, but grew darker at the edges, almost black. Before she sold the house, Elizabeth would have to have the boards replaced, maybe put in carpeting. Something. For a few seconds, I just stood there, looking at the black circle, imagining my brother inside it, permanently. Once I'd spent a few moments staring, I looked up from the stain, really taking the place in for the first time. Elizabeth hadn't been kidding about the antiques. All over the apartment were old hutches and paintings of ships at sea, sets of china and cigar store Indians. My brother had always had an eye for quality. The thing that really stuck with me, though, was a wood carving of an owl, which was standing right in the corner of their old bedroom. The thing was larger than life, coming all the way up to my shoulder, carved all of a single trunk of elm. It was one solid piece, save for a single amber eye made of glass inlay. The other eye hole was empty, giving the odd impression that the carving was winking at you. The wood had been lacquered maybe a dozen times, leaving it with an uneven plastic sheen. Deep cracks ran through one of the wings and the neck, and the base was discolored from water damage. It certainly didn't look lifelike. Yet, somehow, it felt oddly alive. All afternoon, as I packed boxes of Elizabeth's clothes and shoes, the eye followed me. I'm usually not the kind of guy to get spooked by anything, but I guess after everything that had happened to Matty, I got kind of on edge. Eventually, I threw an old towel over the carving's head, covering the eye. It felt a little stupid, but it made me feel a little better. A few hours went by, a bunch of boxes got packed, and it started to get dark. My first instinct was to sleep in the living room, away from the stain. And honestly, away from the owl. I turned off the lights and stretched out on the couch, but it was old and lumpy, impossible to get comfortable. Matty's mattress, practically brand new, lay untouched in the other room. Finally, after maybe an hour of rolling around, my back aching from the day of hard labor, I grabbed the blanket and headed for Matty's old room, carefully walking around the black circle. As I tossed the blanket on the bed, I looked in the corner of the room at the owl carving. The towel I'd tossed over its head lay on the ground now. I wondered how it had fallen off. Maybe I'd been careless when I covered the statue in the first place. The eye caught the moonlight, watching. As stupid as it made me feel, I got up and walked over, picking the towel off the floor. As I did, I heard a distinct sound, something like rats' feet skittering inside the owl. I jumped back halfway to the bed, still holding the towel in my hand. For a moment, I stared at the carving, daring it to move, waiting for another sound. Nothing. The whole time, though, even as I was watching it, the amber eye watched me. Slowly, I walked back to the carving and threw the towel over it. Then, I backed across the room to the bed, not quite realizing I was stepping through the black circle on the floor. Finally, I collapsed onto the mattress, curled under the blanket, and fell asleep. I woke to a cracking sound. At first, everything was still. Then, through the moonlit near dark of the room, I watched as the owl statue began to move. First, its left wing pushed out from inside. Then its right. The wood pushed out perhaps 5 inches, revealing something black and skeletal inside. It looked almost like the Transformers Matty, and I had played with as kids, unseen robots pushing out through the plastic panels of a vehicle to reveal their hidden, shiny bones. I lay transfixed as two thin, black legs pushed out hidden panels near the owl's base. The black legs, at least, they seemed like legs couldn't have been much wider than a curtain rod. They pushed all the way down to the floor. Then the whole carving began to move toward me. The wood swayed on some unseen thing inside it, some too thin creature wearing the wooden owl-like armor. I looked for a way out. I could have jumped through the window, but I was on the second floor, and the thing was moving too fast now anyway. As it reached the bed, it reached out, its thin black arms growing impossibly long, its hands flattening and growing wide like dinner plates. Then it placed them over my ears, and everything went black. I woke to find myself sitting on a wooden chair from the kitchen. The owl must have brought it in while I was passed out. It had placed me inside the black circle. I thought of Maddie, sitting here just like me, not that long ago. I tried to move, but the long black rods that I'd assumed were the owl's legs bound my ankles to the chair. Its hands still gripped my head, their grip only slightly more relaxed than when it had first grasped me. The carving itself stood only a few inches in front of me. Though it fixed me with its amber eye, I could see now that the other eye hole was now open, revealing something black and moving inside. "What are you?" I asked, barely able to speak. I think it laughed. At least, it sounded a little like a laugh. "I'm not quite an owl," it said. Its voice was low, echoing out through the cracks in the owl's wooden shell. "I'm not quite a person, either. Some days I feel closer to bird, some days closer to man. But actually, I've been around long before owls ever flew. Of course," it continued, "owls are generally far less interesting than humans. They're basic creatures. Give them a moonlit night and a field full of frightened mice, and they'll be happy. So happy. Every single time. For humans, nothing is ever enough." It clicked its tongue, then got quiet. "But there is one area in which owls truly excel, which I have always admired," it said. "They are fantastic at turning their heads. So much better than humans. It's an area where it's not even a competition, not even close." As it said this, I felt the pressure from its plate-like hands increase against my temples, and it turned my neck about 90 degrees to the right. Not enough to hurt exactly, but it was certainly uncomfortable. I thought of Matty, his head twisted clean off and set carefully in his lap. "Why are you doing this?" I asked. "Because, as I said, humans are interesting, but also frustrating. Not to belabor the comparison to owls, but truly, your eyesight is quite poor. And not just your night vision. Your ability to see yourselves is quite abysmal. Watching you with only one eye, I can see truths about you that you simply cannot face." "What the fuck are you talking about?" I screamed. It held a black finger to its beaks, shushing me. "Please," it said. "If you must scream, wait until you really, really must. Later in the game, it may be unavoidable." "Game," I whispered. "It's one of my own invention, though it's not too different than some human games. A little bit truth or dare. A little bit mercy. Mostly mercy. The rules aren't complicated. I'll be telling you some truths about your life. Unpleasant truths. Each truth will come with a bit of pain, both mental and physical. When you've had enough, simply speak the word mercy, and your pain will be over, and my head will be in my lap," I said. "Very good," it said. "I knew you were a smart one. In that case, it sounds like no further explanation will be needed. Except that I should add, the result of this exercise will be inevitable. You will eventually beg for mercy. Out of compassion, I'll go ahead and offer you an opportunity to ask for it right now, just to spare yourself the pain ahead." For a moment, I considered the offer. It would be easy to let it simply do what it wanted, to give my head one great, final twist. That would be it. Nothing would hurt after that. But something in me wasn't ready to let go. "No," I said. "Not yet." Deep from within the owl's wooden head, the dark thing looked out at me. Then it seemed to nod. I felt its impossibly strong hands tighten around my head and began to turn it, perhaps 10 more degrees to the right. It was definitely past the point of uncomfortable now. "Along with this physical pain, I'll be stating a truth that carries a similar amount of mental anguish," said the dark, thin thing. "I would like to start by saying that you were never a good brother. As a boy, you were the golden child, taking all of your mother's love, allowing a narrative to develop that your brother was the eternal fuck-up. Though you pretended to be kind to him, secretly, deep down you were happy to play the role of the favored son. Sometimes it even made you happy to hear your mother ranting at him, refusing him meals as he cried in his room, knowing that his misdeeds only made you look all the better." "No," I said, trying to wriggle my neck free. Is that what Maddie said? I was a good brother. After Mom used to tear into him, I'd go to his room, bring him snacks when she threw his dinner in the trash. I took care of him. The thing's hands tightened around my head, turning it ever farther. That happened once or twice, said the thing. It was little comfort to your brother. More often than not, he went to sleep hungry, well aware that no one loved him, least of all you. I wanted to say more, but I knew it would only bring pain. I held my tongue. Even in adulthood, you let your brother flounder, it said. It would have been so easy to help him out with a few $1,000s. You knew he was destitute, selling drugs to make ends meet. He would have blown that money in a week, I said. Might have gone on a bender, gotten himself killed. No, it shouted, growing angry at me now. You were selfish. You wanted to see him twist in the wind. You wanted to be superior. It twisted my neck 5 more degrees. I could feel the skin growing tight as it twisted, the muscles beneath straining against the black hands. Why are you even here? It asked. You never visited when he was alive. Perhaps it actually frustrated you to see him getting his life together. Or is it Elizabeth? You always felt she was too good for Maddie. But you always secretly had a little crush, didn't you? Maybe now that he's dead. No, I said, and hot tears were starting to roll down my face. I was just trying to be a good brother. I swear, too late. The thing shouted. Too late. It twisted my head again. I felt a wetness on my skin and wondered if I had begun to bleed. Mercy, the thing shouted. Simply say the word and this will all be over. Your brother suffered far less. I'm sorry, Maddie, I said, just talking into the dark. I'm sorry, I did my best. I really did love you always, Mercy, shouted the thing. Just keep going, I said. It'll be over soon enough. But I'll never ask for it. Never. As I said the words, the first rays of sun cut through the drawn shades. Where the rays struck the thing's hands, there was a smoky smell. Mercy, quick, or it'll only hurt worse, shouted the thing, but there was a note of fear in its tone now. Go ahead then, I said. But it didn't. The sun shone more brightly. Slowly, the pressure on my temples began to ease. The black limbs withdrew. The owl began to back away into its corner. By the time dawn had fully flooded the room, the carving was back in place. That morning, I returned to Elizabeth's parents' house with a few boxes of her things. I must have looked pretty wrecked, because she asked how I was doing, a note of concern in her voice. I'm okay, I said, but I can't stay here anymore. I've got to get home. She nodded, understanding. I've been thinking about it, she said, and I think I can handle the rest. I've been leaning on you too hard. Suddenly, a wave of panic flooded through me. Promise you won't stay there, I said. Promise, I would never, she said. Even when Maddie was alive, I didn't like sleeping there. All those old antiques. I never liked the smell. But Maddie loved them. So thank you, I said, trying to stay composed. For being so good to him. She reached out and gave me a big hug. I know you two hadn't hung out much over the last few years, but Maddie always said you were there when he needed him, she said. Now I see what he meant. She looked over at my rental truck. There, in the bed, lay the wooden owl. Is that one of Maddie's? She asked. I was hoping you'd let me have it, I said. One last thing to remember him by, she shrugged. I've never seen it before. Maybe he just gotten it. Yeah, I said. Could be. I said goodbye and got in the truck. And then I drove. I headed out in the city, out where the urban sprawl gave way to some kind of forest, marked with a few sunny meadows. When I was satisfied that I'd reached the middle of nowhere, I stopped. I took the statue from the bed of the truck and dragged it out into a sunny field. All the while, I heard the skittering sound inside. It was getting hot toward afternoon, and I could tell the heat and light was affecting the thing inside. I knew the wood was full of little cracks. Some of them must have been big enough to let the light through. It's still only noon, I said. Not quite the hottest part of the day. That'll be hours from now, maybe at 3 or 4. I wonder if you'll make it that far. A small shriek emerged from inside the owl. I ignored it. Now, over in the truck, I've got a saw, I continued. I could cut this owl shell of yours right in half and let the light take you. And I will. But first, I'm going to need you to ask for mercy. Story 4. For my 12th birthday, my dad surprised me with 2 real-life mermaids. I'm currently completely at a loss what to do. I 21F have just escaped my parents after finding something horrifying in my dad's beach house. I've always loved mermaids. Yes, I was one of those kids obsessed with everything mermaid, whether that was TV shows, movies, books, any marine-related media, really, but mermaids especially. I loved everything about the sea, about water, until I almost drowned on my 5th birthday. So, with a newfound fear of even dipping my toes in the shallows, I became fascinated with fake water instead. Mom called it a mental illness. I can see where she was coming from, considering I asked for every pool or water-related game ever made, but I was just a kid. I preferred water to land, and even terrified of it, I still wanted to submerge myself in it, imagining a whole other world. I barely remember almost drowning, only the contorting fear twisting inside me and swallowing me up, the inability to speak, my voice cruelly torn away, my breath stolen as I sank further into the abyss, also known as the deep end of our neighbor's pool. Mom said I didn't realize it was the deep since I was used to our own pool. There I was, sitting on the edge with my legs swinging and a plate of birthday cake in my hands, when I had the bright idea to show the adults how cute I was. This is my mom's retelling, so it's probably exaggerated, but apparently, I dropped headfirst into the pool, cake and all, and sank straight to the bottom. Dad dove in after me, pulling me back to the surface, dragging me from the shallows. But it was too late. I was screaming, hysterical, backing away from the pool like it was filled with lava. The crazy thing is, I remember this exact feeling. I remember staggering back, the ice-cold breeze tickling my cheeks feeling wrong compared to the warmth of the water that was supposed to protect me. The ice-cold concrete of my neighbor's patio felt wrong. Land felt wrong. The water that had almost killed me felt right, and I could never understand why. Instead of caressing me, this cruel underwater world had dragged me down, 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 squeezing my lungs and stealing my air, crushing instead of cradling me. I avoided water and didn't go near any pool after that, even ours. The very one I used to spend every spare hour splashing around in. When Mom tried to bathe me, I insisted on the water being ankle deep, with her using a cup to rinse my hair, as I tilted my head back, squeezing my eyes shut. According to Mom, I would scream until my throat was raw if there was too much water. Even washing my hands and brushing my teeth, I remember timing the flow just right, so I could stick my toothbrush or soapy hands under, count 3 elephants, and then dive out of the bathroom. I flooded the floors on multiple occasions when I forgot to turn off the faucet. But still, somehow, I was fascinated with water itself. I loved how it was still, how it ran and trickled and filled my cupped hands. According to Mom, I told my therapist I wanted to be a fish. However, my therapist had a sort of resolution. She leaned forward and grabbed my hands, squeezing them tight. Okay, Sadie, well, if you're scared of real water, why don't you try fake water? Which, I guess, is how my mermaid obsession started. My therapist started me with little kids' games about solving puzzles underwater, and immediately, I was hooked. Through my fascination with digital water, I found mermaids beautiful, human-like fish people who could breathe underwater, living in vast, towering cities deep, deep under the sea. I watched every Little Mermaid, binging mermaid-themed movies and TV shows. By the age of 9, I was fully convinced I was actually a mermaid, and touching water would magically transform my legs into a tail. It didn't, obviously, so I did what any supposedly mentally ill 9-year-old would do. I swallowed 2 teaspoons of salt mixed with tears of terror before sticking my head underwater for 10 seconds. Again, nothing happened. But I was starting to slowly overcome my fear of being submerged in water, so I lowered myself onto the stairs in the shallow end of our pool and forced myself to get used to it. I was still acclimating when my brother shoved my head under, quickly reminding me of that sensation, the squeezing of my chest, the inability to breathe, choking on bubbles exploding around me. After that, Dad insisted on teaching me how to swim. Like me, he'd always been fascinated with water, so he refused to have a child who couldn't swim. Before my older brother and I were even born, he enrolled us in lessons. Harvey was 5 years older than me, so he could already swim. Dad wanted to take me to the sea, though I was more comfortable in the pool. However, my swimming classes were short-lived. I barely learned how to keep my head afloat when Dad left in the middle of the night and never came back. But neither did my brother. I woke up around midnight to Mom hysterically crying. I discovered the next morning that Dad had taken my brother hookah diving without proper equipment, and Harvey was in the emergency room. Initially, I was told my brother was very sick, which obviously I believed. I was playing Sonic with my brother only yesterday. In my head, he was just sick in the hospital. I spent the day expecting him to drag himself into my bedroom at any time, knock something over, call me a name, and run away. But the house was empty. Mom didn't come out of her room, not even to take me to school. Instead, I watched Cartoon Network all day. I poked my head in my brother's room, and it was a noticeable mess, clothes strewn everywhere, and a half-packed suitcase. When I asked to see Harvey a few days later, Mom told me he was dead. Brain dead, at least. She explained it the best she could, choking on her own words. Harvey had gone too deep, and when trying to resurface, his blood had bubbles and his brain had popped. I don't think she was mentally okay enough to explain to her 9-year-old daughter that her brother was dead. Yeah, no, considering she used our soda stream and a grape to demonstrate the accident with a hysterical smile on her mouth, almost like she thought it was funny. I didn't find it funny. Watching the bubbles in the water and my mother pop a grape between her index and thumb with a huge grin on her face was actually fucking traumatizing. I know people grieve in their own way. Even as a kid though, I was confused when my brother didn't get a funeral. Dad did come back, but only to try and justify his trip with Harvey. He said it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity and that he was just doing what was best for his kids. I already despised him for taking my brother away, but the way he talked about him, insisting that Harvey loves the water, made me want to scream. He was wrong. While I was obsessed with water, my brother had steered away from it, especially the sea. Mom called him a psycho and threw him out. Dad moved to the other side of town, and it was just Mom and me once again. For a long time, I hated my father. I ignored his letters, calls, texts, and the mermaid figurines he sent me for my birthday. I didn't understand grieving, and worse, post-grieving. Did such a thing exist? I understood that I was sad, and sometimes I was happy before feeling guilty for catching myself smiling. I missed him, so I got a diary. I wrote to my brother, telling him everything and nothing, sometimes just what I did that day, or telling him how Mom was. I started attending group therapy. One girl said she forgave her father for killing her mother in a car crash, but her words became entangled in my mind, frustrating me, bleeding into confusion and anger I couldn't control. How could she forgive something like that? I asked her after, and she shrugged and said, it wasn't his fault, but it was my dad's fault. I told her, leaning forward in my chair. He killed my brother, the girl Mia. I think her name was, I could never read her name tag, it was either Mia or Mira, folded her arms, shooting me a glare. Well, maybe you should forgive him. When I asked Mom in the car on the way home, she said the exact same thing. It was an accident, Sadie, Mom said. Your father took your brother diving, and he wasn't ready. She averted her gaze, her hands tightening around the wheel. Harvey asked him to take him out during a storm. Something ice cold trickled down my spine. But you said, she said, Harvey didn't want to go diving. There wasn't a storm that night. I would have heard it. She said my brother hated the ocean, and he wanted no part of it. Mom's eyes darkened, and she opened her mouth like she was going to speak, before changing the subject, flicking on the radio. Do you want to get takeout tonight? I wanted to question her, but I didn't even know what to ask. But then, I was questioning my own memories. Did Mom say what I remembered, or did I mishear her? It took me a long time to realize maybe Harvey's death wasn't Dad's fault after all. After a while of therapy, and listening to other kids' stories, I started to wonder if hating him was the right thing to do. Mom was talking to him civilly at least. The two of them met for coffee every Saturday, and Mom seemed like she had genuinely forgiven him. The other kids asked me if my mom was over Harvey's death. But I guess laughing was inappropriate. Grieving is an individual emotion. Mr. Prescott, our therapist, kept saying, when I was on my knees giggling into the prickly carpet, was my mother over my brother's death? Yes, of course she was. That's what I told my friends, who I made sure stayed far away from our house. Mom was fine, I told everyone. She was completely fine, and definitely not slowly losing her mind, insisting on buying a giant aquarium for her room, and named her new pet flounderfish Harvey. Mom isn't crazy, I told myself, which became my mantra. She just had her own way of grieving. Besides, I did like Harvey. He was pretty cool for a fish, always waiting for me behind the glass when I got home from school. Mom isn't crazy. That's what I told myself again when I caught her opening the tank and trying to fish Harvey out of the water to hold him. Unlike other fish though, he didn't freak out or squirm, instead staying cupped in her hands. So, no, I finally admitted to my therapy class, bursting into tears. Mom definitely wasn't over my brother. I was 11 years old, and my mother was on the brink of a breakdown. She worked all day every day, and on weekends all she talked about was either work or Harvey the fish, often pausing so he could join in conversations. Sometimes she asked him, how's school? I had to quietly remind her that the fish wasn't actually my brother. I needed someone normal. I found normal in the family pool, enveloping myself in my comfort zone. Over the years, I taught myself how to swim, envisioning my tail again. In my mind, I could swim away from my family and never go back. Unfortunately, I was old enough to know mermaids weren't real. The only connection I did have with the ocean was with Harvey. Dad called every day inviting me to visit. I always declined. I wasn't interested in his shiny new life. Dad was an architect and had designed his own house by the sea. I ignored him until my 12th birthday, when he sent a text which just said, "Happy birthday, pumpkin. I have a surprise for you, but you're going to have to come see it yourself. Our door is always open, Sadie. You're going to love them." I wasn't exactly ecstatic. Dad's new girlfriend, who was half his age, smelled like red tide when she came to visit, and I wasn't looking forward to the awkward conversation I would be having with my father. If I'm honest, though, part of me was intrigued by the photos Mom showed me. So, ignoring my therapist, who said, "Just give it a little more time," I rode my bike to his beach house after school. Dad's place teetered on the sea, designed to blend with the ocean itself. On the edge of a cliff, with grandiose pillars which were way too much, lay my father's house, cut off from the rest of the town and definitely showing off his wealth. I wasn't expecting it to be so modern. French doors leading me inside sported betta fish carvings, an axolotl in a 50-gallon tank greeting me with its trademark smile. I was hesitant at first. If I fully walked inside, I wouldn't be able to leave without having a painful conversation with my father. But running away seemed childish even for a soon-to-be 12-year-old. I admit I was impressed. If these were the lengths he'd gone to get my attention, well, he had me hook, line, and sinker. Dad had designed his house to resemble an aquarium. The hallway was illuminated with a soft blue light, every wall a different tank filled with a variety of fish. It was almost like being in real-life Animal Crossing. Farther down, glass floors mimicked the deep ocean, filled with tiny flounders swimming below. I've always been afraid of heights, so stepping on flooring resembling the deep ocean twisted my gut and yet filled me with exhilaration, like stepping across an underwater world. It was both beautiful and way over the top. But that was Dad's mo. We always had to have the best pool when I was a kid. Sadie, Dad's voice startled me when I was staring, transfixed by everything around me. I didn't know what to look at first. Everything was water-themed. Even the stairs. It was pretty sure, but it didn't look lived in. The walls were filled with fish, a beautiful display of marine life showcased on every corner. I found myself pressed up against schools of Nemo fish, spiraling in scarlet streams, stealing away my breath. Beautiful. But there was nothing that made this house a home stained coffee cups and magazines strewn all over the floor. That was Mom's house. Dad's was more like a museum. I was intrigued by the kitchen, lit up in a bioluminescent glow, slowly inching towards it when Dad's voice came again. This time from underneath me. "I'm in the basement, sweetie." I had half a mind to run. It hit me that I didn't want to see my father. I just wanted to see my surprise. The teenage brain is selfish, but I had my reasons. Still, though, I found myself drawn to the basement, my sneakers making smacking noises down the steps. Unlike upstairs, the lower levels of Dad's house were yet to be renovated. Thinking of the Death Star, there was no stair rail. My hands grazed cold brick walls before darkness became ocean blue, like walking on the seafloor. The low hum of a filtration system cut through the silence, my steps quickening. The basement was not what I was expecting. A simple room with one singular tank. The stink of seawater and bleach drowned my nose and throat, both clinical and otherworldly, forcing my legs further. Dad stood in front, grinning beneath a banner saying, "Happy 12th birthday." I was already taking steps forward, my body in control of my mind. The tank was darker than the others, tiny green lights at the bottom illuminating clear water. I could barely register Dad's words, my gaze glued to the glass. His voice sounded like ocean waves crashing against the shore, wading in and out of my ears. "I asked my friends for a favor," he said. "They specialize in marine research, and, well, during their last expedition, they found something incredible, Sadie." Dad's grin was contagious, and in 3 strides, I was pressing my face against the glass. I don't know what I was expecting. Was it a new species of fish? "They're shy," Dad hummed. "Just stay there, and they'll come over to you." I found my voice strangled in my throat, my skin prickling with goosebumps. Something warm expanded in my chest when a face appeared behind the glass, a beautiful girl with long dark hair haloing around her, tiny points on her ears, and strange rugged skin. But it wasn't her face I was mesmerized by. Yes, she was hypnotizing. Every part of her seemed to glow, wide green eyes, and a glittering smile. I staggered back, a cry clawing at my throat, when I realized she didn't have legs. Instead, a long blue tail was molded to her torso, each scale intricate and sparkling. The skin below her breast was rugged, slits carved into her flesh. Gills. This couldn't be happening, I thought, dizzily. I was staring at a real-life mermaid. She was so pretty, graceful, gently tapping on the glass, playing an invisible piano with her fingers. I was joining in, laughing when the mermaid pressed her fingertips against mine. When movement came behind her, a shadow looming into view. It was a boy this time, dark brown hair billowing around him, adorned with seaweed, a green tail in place of legs. There was a noticeable scar on his throat. It made me wonder if a fish had attacked him. The merman was different. Unlike his female companion, he wasn't smiling, instead folding his arms and refusing to meet my gaze. When he accidentally made eye contact, he turned and flicked his tail in my face, hiding behind the girl. Dad laughed. The male is quite standoffish. Don't worry, he's like that with everybody. He wasn't easy to catch. I could barely speak, staring at the girl who waved, her smile broadening. Uh-huh, I managed to choke out. I didn't notice my father wrapping his arms around me. His touch felt foreign and wrong, but also comforting. I hadn't hugged him in so long. I found myself missing him, and the conversation I wanted to have, all of those poisonous words in my throat, contorted into childish squeals of joy. They're yours, Sadie, Dad murmured into my hair. I have a deal where I can keep them here for observation, but they're officially yours, mermaids, I said. Dad nodded. Well, the scientific name for them is HAB, or human-like aquatic beings. But yes, he chuckled. They are mermaids. Dad paused, striding over to the tank. I noticed the male mermaid flinch, almost immediately swimming over to the glass, tapping his fingers against the pane. I joined him, raising my fingers while watching his dark brown curls fly around him, bubbles escaping his mouth when he parted his lips in what I think was a greeting. The points in his ears reminded me of Phi, and I couldn't stop smiling. He looked so human, and yet these tiny details, like his ears and narrow features, told me he belonged in the ocean. I had dreamed of being able to breathe underwater, and this boy was doing just that, staring at me with coffee brown eyes. When his head inclined slowly, I couldn't resist a giggle. I figured I looked pretty alien to him. Dad nudged me playfully. We haven't figured out their language yet. We know it's quite similar to whales or even dolphins. It's rare when they do speak, but it's beautiful, Sadie. Dad's eyes were wide. It's almost like they're singing the melody of their world, the songs of their people. I prodded the glass, and the merman copied, his lips curling into a scowl. The female mermaid swam over, shoving him out of the way. She seemed more excited, following my fingers excitedly. What do you think you're going to call them? Dad hummed. I turned to him. They don't have names? He shrugged, and then Dad's expression was my father again, his eyes growing sad, like he remembered why I was here, and just like me, Dad didn't want to talk about my brother. Turning to face the mermaids, his smile faded. They were originally named Specimen 1 and 2, but I don't think those names suit them. I met the girl's eyes, and like a child, her smile broke out into a grin. While she was wide-eyed and smiley, the male mermaid folded his arms, carefully tracking me with his gaze, lip curled, like he could sense me thinking up names. I traced the glass, the seaweed entangled in the boy's hair, almost resembling a crown. I half wondered, giddily, if the male was a prince. Phelan, I said, without thinking, and to my shock, he rolled his eyes. Dad cleared his throat. The male seems to have remarkably similar characteristics to a human male, he said. His paperwork suggests he copies human expressions. I moved on to the girl, who was playful, tapping her fingers against the glass. Era, the girl nodded excitedly, copying my smile. Dad was hesitant this time to touch me, instead clapping me on the shoulder. I think she likes her name, he said, heading to the door. Elle is making pasta, if you want to join us. No pressure, sweetie. Dad left me with the mermaids, and admittedly, the first thing I did was jump up and down like a 12-year-old. I ate dinner with Dad and his girlfriend that night, and I waited to have the talk, but it never came. In fact, when I visited the following weekend, everything I wanted to tell him was suffocated by the beings in his basement. I spent hours with the two of them, talking to Era about everything from school to my worries about my mother. She would nod and try to listen, her eyes wide, like she could understand me. I figured that wasn't the case when I lied and told her an asteroid was going to destroy the planet, and she nodded excitedly, lips spreading into a grin. Sometimes she copied me. When I laughed, she did too, or she tried to. I don't think it was easy for her under the water. I started missing therapy sessions to spend time with the mermaids, but it was only Era who engaged with me, always waiting for me when I arrived, sometimes asleep, curled up at the bottom of the tank. Phelan, meanwhile, completely ignored me, instead spending all of his time either scowling at me or closer to the surface. I caught him trying to swim up several times, only to dive back down, returning to his little spot to continue brooding. As I got older, I expected the mermaids to age too. But instead, they seemed to be physically frozen around what looked like the ages of early 20s, judging from their looks. I turned 13, and I spent every summer and weekend with them. Dad told me to entertain them, try and get them used to human activities, so I introduced them to my phone, pressing it to the glass. While Era seemed impressed by literally everything, Phelan did his signature eye roll, as if saying, "Oh, wow, it's a weird device with a light. I've already seen one." Dad did say the male mermaid was talented at mimicking human expression, so I figured Phelan had seen a phone. So, in my quest to impress the stubborn merboy, I showed him a TV, and then my Nintendo 3DS. He didn't seem interested in the TV, but his eyes lit up when I showed him Pokémon. I think it was the bright colors, but his eyes seemed glued to the screen, following my little character. I made an unspoken pact with him. I showed him Pokémon, playing it with him every time I visited, and he stopped with the scowling and the rolling of the eyes. Phelan didn't stop being an asshole, but every time I stepped into the basement, it was him who was waiting, eagerly, his face pressed against the glass. When he saw me, the merman leaned back, pretending he wasn't waiting for me. I showed him a new game, Zelda, and he surprised me with the smallest of smiles, his eyes glued to my screen. Era sometimes joined us, but she grew bored easily, either falling asleep or swimming up to the surface. After introducing him to video games, Phelan was a lot more animated. I was 14 when I dragged myself once again to Dad's beach house. It was my first year of junior high, and I had nobody to talk to about the mermaids. When I visited them, Phelan was on the surface, leaning against the side, his head comfortably nestled in his arms. I noticed the tank was open, so it must have been feeding time. Every day around 5 p.m., Dad opened up the tank, dropping in what looked like mutilated fish guts and little flakes. Phelan always ignored the food, while Era immediately dove for fleshy entrails, stuffing them into her mouth. Phelan needed a little coaxing, so Dad thrust a long metal pole into the water, gently nudging the merman towards the food. That day, there was no sign of my father, and both mermaids were on the surface. Phelan with his head in his arms, and Era looking lost, her eyes wide. It was the first time I had seen her without her excited little grin. Phelan must have sensed me, since his head jerked up when I dropped my backpack on the floor. This was the first time I'd seen him fully on the surface, but when he locked eyes with me, I realized he was panting, struggling to breathe, his fingers gingerly prodding at his throat. The air must have been hurting him, I thought. He wasn't used to our air, so why was he so insistent on staying on the surface? Stupid boy. I made my way over to the tank, and to my surprise, he swam over, sticking his head over the side. Phelan made a choking sound, and I understood he was trying and failing to mimic our language. He tried again, his eyes strained, lips parting, but no words came out, only strange guttural noises I could almost mistake for words. This happened twice. The second time, the tank was half shut, but Phelan broke the surface when he saw me come in, parted his lips, and tried to speak, seemingly frustrated with his inability to mimic human speech. He tried again, and this time Elle could see he was visibly struggling to stay on the surface. Era, to my confusion, pulled him back under the water, and to me, pointed upwards. I did my best to communicate with her, just like Dad told me. I had to speak with my hands instead of my mouth. "You want me to open the tank?" I said, motioning upwards. Sadie, Dad joined me, carrying a bucket full of entrails. He dumped the food in the tank and shut the lid all the way, flashing me a smile. "I know they're pretty to look at, but they're also dangerous," he nodded to Phelan, who ignored the food, instead pressed against the glass, glaring at my father. "These beings are carnivores, sweetie. I don't mean to scare you, but I don't think swimming with them would be a whole lot of fun." I found myself nodding, watching sharp red dilute the depths, Era snatching up tangled fish intestine. I watched her eat it, sharp incisors biting through a cloud of red, obscuring my vision, and spreading around her. The smile on her face no longer looked playful. She looked happy to be eating, and something ice-cold trickled down my spine when her eyes met mine, this time not with curiosity, but something else entirely, something I was in denial of. After that day, I guess I started to grow up. The mermaids in my dad's basement were beautiful, yes, but all signs pointed to them also trying to lure me into their tank. Dad didn't say they will eat you, but he did supervise my visits from then on, making sure I kept my distance. The two of them didn't change, but my childhood fantasy of friendly fish people darkened to a more plausible reality. Phelan and Era were not my friends, nor were they my presents. I was the naive prey who was almost fish food. I stopped visiting after Phelan started gesturing me inside their tank. I wanted nothing to do with them. Growing up, I still saw them during holidays. But the basement was filling up with other things, my dad's belongings and my toys from childhood. I saw them once before college, the two of them slamming themselves against the tank when I walked in. I couldn't tell if they were excited or hungry. Era's eyes were almost sad, her lips parting as if to say, "You left us." Phelan tapped the glass, cocking his head. I noticed his scar was bigger. Maybe Dad accidentally caught it when he was coaxing the merman to his food. I think Phelan knew it was a goodbye. He didn't understand the concept of college, and I wasn't going to try to explain it to him. I left them like that, and never went back. Over these years, I wondered if Dad had released them back into the sea. Ever since I left home at 18, I've been flying to and from college every couple of months, due to a respiratory condition that came out of nowhere. I thought it was the mold in my college dorms, but when I moved to another room, I still found myself waking up, choking on air like my lungs refused to work. Numerous scans informed me I'm completely healthy, and all the doctor can give me is an inhaler. I was supposed to meet with a specialist in town anyway, so I figured I would pay Dad a visit. I headed back to Dad's beach house with the excuse to pick up some old trinkets I left behind. There was no sign of him, so I let myself in, making my way down to the basement. Dad had changed the lighting to a duller blue, and immediately I was comforted with the familiar stink of salt water and strong bleach that smelled right. The stairs were wet, I noticed, slowly making my way down to the basement. The tank was still there, illuminated in dazzling blue. But it was bigger. I saw Era before she saw me, and I noticed a change in her. She wasn't smiling. Instead, the mermaid's eyes were alert, her fingers tapping against the glass. "Hey," I greeted her, a cough I couldn't control taking over. Era jumped, startled, when I knocked on the glass. Her gaze found mine, and something twisted in my gut. Her expression was wild, contorted, and not what I remembered. When she pointed upwards for me to open the tank, I shook my head, biting back the urge to say, "Nice try." I could tell she hadn't eaten yet. The tank was fresh, so my dad was yet to feed them. "Where's Phelan?" I asked, remembering how to talk with my expression. Era didn't respond. With a stoic face, she pointed upwards again. The absurdity of me talking to my childhood mermaid friend sent me into fits of laughter which became a coughing fit. When I spluttered out a cough, her eyes widened, and I swore her gaze flicked to my torso. With the mermaid mostly ignoring me, I went in search of my trinkets I left behind in one of the towering boxes filling the basement. I was looking for my music box, and an old mermaid figurine Harvey had given me for my 5th birthday. I found myself going through memory lane, diving into boxes of old toys in my endless collection of mermaid memorabilia. Shoving aside holiday decorations, I stuck my hands in another box, pulling out a folded yellow dress. The dress was cute, but I didn't remember wearing it. I thought maybe it was Elle's, but it was way too small. Elle was a curvy woman. Throwing the dress aside, I pulled out cargo shorts this time, followed by a short-sleeved band shirt and a Lakers cap covered in dust. With the clothes in my hands, I had a sudden hysterical thought that these were my brother's clothes. But he was dead. He died when I was 9 years old. I could feel my hands starting to tremble, digging deeper into the box. This time, a backpack with a tiny Pikachu attached to the zipper. I went through it, pulling out workbooks and crumbled schedules, a bottle of water, and a crumbling sandwich covered in mold. Opening the workbooks, I flicked through pages and pages of intricate handwriting. A stress toy was at the very bottom of the pack, collecting dust. I could sense my breathing starting to accelerate when my hands grasped a bright green handbag filled with makeup, a dead phone, and a laptop. But it was right at the bottom of the box, where I found the nail in the coffin that sent bile shooting up my throat. 2 college IDs. The first, neat and looked after, on a red string, belonged to a scowling 22-year-old English major, Matthew Whittam. The second ID tag, covered in scribbles and doodles, was 23-year-old Quinn Cartwright, a smiling brunette who, according to her tag, was a film student. The tag slipped out of my hands, and I puked, heaving up my mediocre dinner. Era and Phelan. The beings in the tank were not mermaids. They were human. Before I could stop myself, I grabbed the clothes again, the yellow dead with noticeable smears of red on the collar, and the cargo shorts torn and bloodied when I turned them inside out. I don't even remember standing up. With the ID tag in my hands, I stumbled over to the tank, pressing Era's identity against the glass. But she didn't even recognize herself, slowly cocking her head to the side. This hurt, a pang in my chest physically squeezing my lungs. This time, I opened the tank, and the girl broke the surface. She didn't speak, because she couldn't, instead flailing her arms. I thought back to the scar on Phelan's throat, and I felt sick to my stomach. Instead of speaking, Era pointed to the door, her eyes wide and desperate. It's okay, I told her calmly. Where's Phelan? When her eyes narrowed to slits, I caught myself. Matthew, I corrected quickly. Where is Matthew? Before she could respond, my father's voice sounded from upstairs, followed by what sounded like muffled screaming. Era's head snapped to me when the muffled screaming grew closer, my father's footsteps following. I could hear the sound of something wet hitting concrete, like a tail. Era pointed towards a box, and I understood, diving behind the door. The wet slapping noises continued, all the way down the stairs, before my father appeared, a bloody apron over jeans and a shirt, dragging along a figure. It was another guy, lying on his stomach, blood spilling from his lips and nose, streaking down his bare torso. I had to slap my hand over my mouth. I could still see the guy's legs, or what used to be his legs, twisted into something resembling a tail. His ears still looked human. The sharp points almost looked man-made. Dad dragged the boy across the floor, panting. It's okay, he told the boy who was half human. The guy was struggling to breathe, like a fish out of water. Once your lungs have gotten used to the water, you'll adapt. When he yanked the boy by his grotesque legs, slowly morphing into a tail, the boy coughed up something that dripped down his chin. His eyes were wide and unseeing, his arms dead weights by his side. Dad carried the boy, bridal style, up a ladder to the surface. I thought he was going to throw him in, but instead, my father pulled out a knife. It's okay, he kept telling the guy in sharp breaths. I know it hurts, but you won't be able to adapt if I don't do this. I could see Era watching, her hand over her mouth, as my father dragged the blade across the boy's throat, slicing it open, and dumping him into the water. The boy sank, his body bent in an arch, sharp red blooming around him. He was dead. His tail was limp, his arms dragging him down. Era caught the boy, cradling him in her arms. Dad watched, a smile pricking on his lips. The merman jolted in Era's arms, his eyes shooting open, and when he breathed by habit, clutching his chest, a stream of bubbles flying from his mouth. When the nameless boy caught hold of himself, he pounded his fists against the glass, lips parting in a silent cry. Dad ignored him, dumping fish guts into the water and forcing him to eat them. It struck me why Phelan and Era were only alert when they didn't eat. My father was drugging their food, keeping them docile. He had caught their voices directly from their throat, carved into their bodies, cruelly molding them into my stupid fucking childhood fantasy. When my dad left them, Era tried to tell me to stay to help her calm down the new merman, who kept pounding his fists against the glass. But I think part of her wanted me to hunt down her companion. I knew from the panicked glances she kept sending me that she was worried for him. Dad said his office was out of bounds when I was a kid, and I never thought much of it. When I pushed through the door, which was surprisingly unlocked, I realized why. All around me, bathed in clinical white light, were towering tanks filled with both human and fish parts. Floating torsos and severed heads, victims no longer with identities. Dad was studying how to combine the two. His notes were strewn everywhere, screwed up and thrown in an overflowing trash can, and stuck to the wall. I found Phelan pinned to a surgical table, a tube stuck down his throat. The human boy cruelly twisted into something inhuman, and yet my father was sadistic enough to continue the facade, leaving the seaweed entwined in his curls like he was a circus act. There was a sensor above him, every movement he made setting off a sprinkler, soaking him. It was when he didn't move, which glued me to the spot. When his tail dried up, I panicked, reaching to wave my arm in front of the sensor. Instead, however, to my shock, his tail started to change, contorting and morphing into something that resembled legs, but were more grotesque, cruelly stitched to his torso in a horrific attempt to change from a mermaid into a human boy. When the sensor activated, soaking him again, Phelan's body jerked, and he choked up splattered red, splashing the tube. His eyes flickered open, and he opened his mouth to speak. But his words were gibberish, his voice an incomprehensible hiss. I remembered how to move. Police. That was my first thought. I needed to get the cops. I tried to leave, stumbling over to the door, but something caught my eye. Another tank, and floating inside it, an all-too-familiar face. But he wasn't supposed to be so limp, so wrong. Unmoving. Harvey's body had long since decomposed, and yet pieces of flesh still remained. Still my big brother, and yet his body wasn't, cruelly ripped apart and stitched together, a mutilated fishtail attached to his torso. His skin was covered in mismatched scales, like a virus taking over, shredding him apart, only leaving a slimy, green-tinged substance coating him. Harvey was dead, but the thing stitched to him, entangling decomposing flesh, was still alive. I got out of there, and then the house in 4 single breaths. I ran home. I woke up yesterday, unable to breathe, this time choking up blood. Mom wasn't there. When I stepped into the shower, I pieced together my thoughts and what exactly I was going to tell the cops without sounding crazy. But when my fingers grazed the skin of my torso, just below my breast, I could feel 3 singular gashes in my skin. Feeling the other side, there they were, splitting my flesh apart, warm to the touch, and yet somehow feeling natural. I can't believe I'm saying this, but being in water feels better. I can finally breathe. But I find myself stumbling when I'm trying to walk, and I'm terrified. I keep getting out of breath, and my skin feels too dry, like it's sucked of moisture. I tried to get into the basement earlier, and unsurprisingly it's locked. There's no sign of Mom or Dad. The only thing I have right now is Mom's stupid pet fish. I feel like I'm suffocating on air. You have to help me. Please help me save the people trapped in my father's basement.